This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
It's both kind and rational to like knowing animals. You can't deny it's fashionable to like knowing animals.
Hello everyone, welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Milburn and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by the Animal Publics book series from Sydney University Press. Now, although all the books in this series are academic works, they are, unlike many academic works, very, very affordable. So they're not just accessible to people with access to a university library. Instead, they're accessible to many people who choose to buy them. Some of them are even open access, meaning that you can access them for free online from anywhere in the world. Also, a quick shout out to Elizabeth Usher, who provided the updated theme tune for Knowing Animals. To learn more about Elizabeth, visit veganthused.com. Today, I'm very pleased to introduce you to Dr. Benjamín Schultz-Figueroa. Ben is an assistant professor in the Department of Film and Media Studies at Seattle University. He works in critical animal studies, the history of science, documentary studies, and science fiction studies. Today we're going to talk about his 2023 book, The Celluloid Specimen, Moving Image Research into Animal Life, which was published by the University of California Press. By the way, this is an open access book. It's released under the Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives license, which means that anyone can read or download the book for free from anywhere in the world. Welcome to the podcast, Ben.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Can you start by telling us what led you to work on this topic?
So this is a book that comes out of my dissertation work. And at that time, I was reading a lot of critical animal studies theory. Think Derrida, Beast and the Sovereign, and Agamben. And I had started to build up a theoretical framework for understanding how animals related to our political life and our political spheres. But I also had a history as an experimental documentary filmmaker, and that led me to this impulse to want to find an object to compare my ideas against and kind of see where the rubber hits the road. And that led me to these films that were produced by behavioral psychologists in the early to mid 20th century, which was really an ideal topic for exploring these ideas because these figures were very interested in, one, recording and observing animals through film, and then two, using these observations as a way of promoting or instigating political programs. And so they had very big ambitions for changing the world through their psychology, through their study, through their practice, and particularly a practice based on observing and often filming animals. Just like I was hoping would happen, what that did end up happening in that the actual specificity and details of these figures, Robert Yerkes, who is the founder of American primatology, specifically in the laboratory setting, Neil E. Miller and the Yale Institute of Human Relations, which was part of this kind of turn to the culture and personality school of behavior, and then B.F. Skinner, a world-renowned psychologist. Each of them had very complex and, in fact, baffling relationships with animals that I needed to adjust my theories and my thinking in order to really comprehend. So, for instance, Yerkes was a staunch eugenicist and very interested in basically creating a hierarchy around gender and race and species. And yet at the same time, he professed a love of his animals and a desire to use film to decenter the human and to experience the world of animals outside of the human sensorium. And to me, that was utterly baffling. How do you square those two things when I first got to the project? So I had to adjust my theories in order to get to a place where I could understand and properly theorize these various contradictions that I kept finding in the history itself.
What are celluloid specimens?
So celluloid specimens are a term that I coined for this book to refer to laboratory recordings of animals and specifically animal experiments. I begin the book with an account of finding these films at the Yerkes laboratory where they've been filed within the archiving system alongside body parts of an actual animal. And this led me to think about what does it mean to have a celluloid recording of an animal on film and then to preserve that recording within a scientific setting. And it became clear to me that it meant many things. I mean, one, it was a sign of power. It was a sign of domination and often recordings of extreme pain or suffering. Two, it was a part of this animal's life. It was, within the institution, it's literally thought of as a part of their body almost. And then within this institutional framework, too, we have to think about it as part of what makes this institution, in this case, primatology lab, run, right? And especially when we start thinking about these primatology labs as part of political projects, as was the case with Yerkes, then these also become political texts. So I thought about the celluloid specimen as a way of registering and pointing to both the corporeal elements of the animal that get kind of preserved and stored and amputated, and then also the rhetorical elements of the specimen that becomes part of an institution and can be used for various purposes.
So these kinds of films are not what I typically imagine being studied by film studies scholars. And I thought it was very interesting in your introduction that you draw this sharp distinction between animal film studies that's come before, which have thought about animal films as encounters, and what you call an infrastructural approach to animals on film. Could you introduce us to that distinction?
Sure. So within film studies, a lot of emphasis has been placed on the encounter as a space where human, non-human relationships get kind of navigated or reinforced. And there, a lot of conversation has been built up around whether or not a film decenters the human, pulls humans outside of anthropocentrism or anthropomorphism, think Disney. So there's a lot of question about the space of the theater itself and what happens when the screening occurs. But to me, we need to think beyond that and think about how these films are placed within particular contexts. This especially becomes clear for me with Yerkes, who, again, was interested in using film to decenter the human, to escape the confines of human language, and to understand the sensorium of animals. And yet, when we understand it within the broader infrastructural and political history that it was a part of, it becomes part of this eugenicist project, which is about simulating and producing a kind of eugenicist management through sympathy and empathy. And in that context, the politics of the human-animal encounter are very different than they would be in another context where we might say engaging with an animal beyond human-centered bounds is a good thing, right? To me, it's very important to have that infrastructural and historical context to understand the stakes of these encounters.
I did have some questions about Yerkes specifically. It might be helpful if first you could just introduce us to him as a figure, but also especially the films that he produced or the way that he was using films.
Robert Yerkes is primarily known for two major things. One is the establishment of the primatology labs, which were the first primatology labs in the United States dedicated to studying primates. The second is for his World War I intelligence exams, which took what was a really fledgling industry of intelligence exams and applied it to millions of people entering the Army, the US Army, for World War I. And these intelligence exams were then used to decide where incoming recruits should be positioned within the military hierarchy. And these are two connected projects, I argue in the book, and especially around the question of media and how media can be used to evaluate and understand an individual. And that's what you see in Yerkes' films. He has these very interesting open-ended films that aren't about demonstrating a particular idea per se or measuring a response rate, but rather are just about engaging in a kind of sympathy with the animal where you can understand their motivation. So he'll have films that are like Maternal Behavior in Chimpanzee, where he just says, look at the animal, can't you see how she is feeling? And will then be treated to an image of a chimpanzee desperately wanting its child back or having some relationship with another chimpanzee. And then the process of sympathizing with them is that we undergo as audience members is meant to then become part of this broader system of power where eugenicist managers will look at individuals and groups of people and evaluate them based on a kind of sympathy and then position them within a hierarchy based on that process.
I see. So sympathy for animals in this case can actually be put to quite sinister purposes. It's not a kind of universally good thing.
Absolutely not. Yeah, and I think sympathy with animals, this was again one of those issues where I came to it with the assumption that that would mean certain political commitments beyond just the human animal relationship. But what I found was that is absolutely not the case. And it made me really rethink how other forms of political oppression can intersect with speciesism and animals and the human animal divide and how that is policed, because I don't think this is a straightforward process. I think that it often can be quite complicated and contradictory, or what would seem contradictory. And it's entirely possible for you to have a system that is based on sympathy with animals and yet also structured around their oppression and the oppression of other people.
The second part of your book is about Neil Miller. Again, perhaps I could ask you to introduce Miller and explain what role films had for him.
Sure. So Neil E. Miller was part of Yale's Institute of Human Relations, which was this group of academics that were funded at Yale in order to study this massive project of human relations, whatever that meant, in its largest form. After years of just sort of fumbling about, they eventually landed on using animal research as a kind of integrating device that could allow them to speak across fields. So Miller was a behavioral psychologist. He was filming with albino lab rats and using those rats as symbols or models or abstractions of behavior writ large. And then those principles that he was finding in his rats and filming in his rats, he makes these kind of films that are about behavioral principles, were then applied to all sorts of other settings, including relationships between workers and their bosses, or husband and his wife, or much more dramatically and upsettingly, there's one example where they try to apply these behavioral dynamics to a white lynch mob in an anonymized southern town and explain the behavior of the lynch mob participants using findings from rat studies, rodent studies. So here again, it's a sort of response to Yerkes, who saw the behavior of individuals as inborn, as part of their sort of genetic endowment, and thus defined by species, defined by gender, defined by race. For Miller and his peers, they saw differences as being produced by society and by setting. And in this context, they imagined the laboratory apparatus as essentially a symbol for culture writ large. and the lab rat as a kind of individual organism, a blank slate that then becomes an individual, becomes differentiated through its relationship to the setting, which is this scientific apparatus. So there they thought, okay, we can simulate all sorts of cultural differences and cultural dynamics within just this relationship between the lab rat and the experimental apparatus. And that includes things like class structure, social violence, the effects of urban living or overpopulation as a means of modeling and controlling the phenomenon. And film played a crucial role here in that it was used to build these models of social effects.
You close the section of your book on Miller with a very striking vision of rats taking over the earth after humans are extinct. But you argue that Miller's films, quote, call into question humanity's own tenuous claim on the sole ownership of historical agency. I thought that was a really powerful image. Could you explain what that means?
Within Miller's own framework, the rats are solely being used to model parts of human society. But I argue that this also implies a vision in which rats themselves and other animals are part of the same phenomenon that humans are subject to, including historical change, right? And things like class and racial dynamics and gender politics, that all of this leads into the animal world. And so there's a very interesting reversal that's quite possible there, where instead of using animals to explain and model the human world, we acknowledge that animals are part of the same historical processes that lead to human history, or what is considered human history. And therefore, the boundaries start to really bleed.
The third part of the book addresses the work of B.F. Skinner. He's probably the most famous of your three human subjects. But again, I thought it might be useful if you could just quickly introduce Skinner and especially the roles that film plays in his work.
Skinner is definitely the most well-known of the figures. He's especially known for his position on radical behaviorism, which was this idea that essentially all behavior, whether by human or animal, can be explained through the interaction between an organism and its environment rather than some internal process of cognition and reasoning. He was very controversial for claiming that processes like creativity or rational thought or good versus bad, morality decisions, that all of that came down to your experiences and your in relationship to a broader world. So in that sense, he became this very contested figure. He's unlike the other figures in the book in that he doesn't use film to either capture some kind of internal reality that the way that Yerkes did, or to model some sort of abstraction about behavior the way that Miller did. Instead, Skinner just sees film as a way of influencing and affecting audience members. And he's not that interested in what film can reveal about what is being filmed. Instead, he's seeing it as a cultural stimulus like any other stimulus that affects how we behave. And so in that context, he's using film in all of these very interesting ways, some of which are quite troubling. So one of the chapters is about this project that he worked on during World War II called Project Pigeon, in which pigeons were trained to guide a bomb, a missile, from within the head of the missile to enemy boats. And they were trained using film. And the films allowed the birds to practice this process, and then with the intention of eventually they would actually be placed inside the head of a bomb and guiding this missile to enemy ships. But what's really interesting is it wasn't just used to train the animals, it was also used to condition the military higher-ups into accepting this project. So he made a film that was very convincing to the military brass. But then when he showed it, he demonstrated it with the live pigeons, he was laughed off the stage. There was a sudden realization when it wasn't on screen that, oh, this is absurd. We're handing over this giant explosive payload to a pigeon. What were we thinking? Yet there was something about the way that the films had been crafted as a kind of stimulus that convinced them to do it. So again, he's sort of using film across these various domains to affect and control behavior.
The pigeon seems to be quite a striking figure for you, or your analysis of Skinner at least. You describe, another memorable phrase, you describe the pigeon as a figure for our times. What do you mean by that?
This goes back to, again, Skinner's own promotion of his work, where he used this pigeon as an image of the dramatic possibilities of behavioral study and its capacity to change behavior. For Skinner himself, he saw this as a utopian image, that when you show that you can control and change the behavior dramatically of an animal, and specifically a lowly pigeon, that then you also demonstrate that these kinds of changes could be performed on humans, and human society could be changed for the better. For his detractors, they saw this as fascism, and he was often called a fascist, although he himself saw himself as a sort of anarchist, anti-capitalist. And the contradictions in his political systems are quite interesting, and I get into that in the book. But again, in both instances, the pigeon is a symbol to some extent of what it means to be a controlled life form, to live in these vast systems that are set out to control you in ways that you may or may not be able to comprehend. I argue that that defines all of us these days, and that indeed many of the kind of structures of power that exist around us are operating on the assumption that we are like pigeons, we are like Skinner's pigeons, that if they know enough about our past, if they monitor our inputs and our outputs, that they can predict our behavior in some way and thus control it. So the question of the pigeon becomes really a question of human society in a kind of information age or in a cybernetic age. There, I think we can all kind of sympathize with the pigeon a little bit and see ourselves in their place in the way that Skinner was doing, but which might lead us to different conclusions than Skinner's.
Let me ask a difficult question that I'm sure you will have spent some time thinking about. You mentioned earlier that these films, these celluloid specimens, frequently document really awful violence that we've committed against particular individual animals. Do you think there might be something voyeuristic in watching these?
I think that could be the case, but I would also point to the fact that most of these films are treated as toxic substances that need to be hidden. Some of the films, it took me over a year to get access to, and there are many of the films that I was not able to get access to because these are treated as hidden objects within the scientific community. There's a really interesting period right at the birth of film where physiologists who were performing vivisections said, oh, well, we could use a film. We could film one vivisection, and then we would never have to perform that same vivisection again for scientific purposes, for training purposes, for research purposes. Wouldn't that be a great use to the field? Then we won't have to deal with this problem anymore of people protesting animal pain and suffering. But then very quickly they said, oh, but what if other people watch these films beyond the psychologists? Because then it will mean something totally different, and it will mean something about our field. And so in that case, there you see why it's so important for other parties to watch these films and to think about these films. Because it's not just prurient, it's also about reimagining what they mean and what their import is, and what it says about science, what it says about history, what it says about politics, because otherwise it will just be defined by the people who made them. And I think that's a problem, which we see happen over and over again in this history.
Before we move on to our regular questions, I wanted to ask you a bit of a curveball question, and that's that it's relatively unusual to have an open access academic monograph. So could you explain how that came about?
UC Press has a program where basically if you are working on a book based on a dissertation completed at one of the UC systems, they will freely create the book as an open access resource. I completed my dissertation at UC Santa Cruz, so that allowed me to take advantage of this program. But it was also, there came a point where my editor and I realized there's a lot of resources that the open access format will grant us that a traditional book would not have, especially being housed online. This allowed me to include clips and video objects, including full films, that many people will have never seen. These are, again, hidden objects. These are often objects that are thought of as throwaway films, right? Why would anyone watch them? So this gave me a real opportunity to allow people to experience these films for themselves and come to their own conclusions.
Now, Ben, we ask every guest on Knowing Animals 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Yes.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Definitely. It was Why Look at Animals by Jonathan Burt, which utterly fascinated me. It was not a framework I had really ever conceived of before. And I had a very close friend who said, we were programming a series of experimental films. And he said, let's do it about animals. And I thought, why would we do that? And then he gave me this article to read, and it just sparked something in me. And I've spent the last, 20 years working on this topic.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Yes. I believe it was an article on the exact phenomena I was talking about a moment ago with the physiologists and their response to the introduction of film as a technology, which was published as part of the Corporeality in Cinema book, as a chapter in that book.
If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
I think that would be the work of Nicole Shukin in Animal Capital. This is a complex and theoretically dense book, but it's one whose ideas I just keep going back to in terms of thinking about the ways in which capitalism as a system uses both animals' bodies and their images in a way that it deals with corporeality and with symbolism. And I think it's so important to think about both.
What do you think is the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
Well, my answer is not specific to animals, but I think using the classroom as a place of engagement with students is so important. And that is really where our political power lies, is in the fact that we engage with so many hundreds, sometimes even thousands of students at a transformative period in their life, and we get to talk to them in depth about ideas. And so I would say teaching these ideas is essential to having an impact. So that would be one part. The other part is opening up access to the classroom so that we can have these conversations with more people, with people from more diverse backgrounds. That would be my answer.
If you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
Well, the simple answer would be to abolish industrial agriculture. I mean, this is clearly such a blight on our world in terms of both the treatment of humans and animals, in terms of the destruction of the earth. It's such a pernicious industry that is having such negative effects on the world. But at the same time, I think this leads to broader changes that would have to happen. If we were to imagine a world in which there would not be industrial agriculture, massive changes would have had to have occurred in terms of our relationship to animals, our relationship to other peoples, our relationship to the land and environment. And that's, in my view, a better world, a world I would like to live in.
What are you working on next?
I have a special issue coming out, hopefully this winter, in the Journal of Environmental Media on cinezoonosis, which is thinking about zoonotic disease and its relationship to film. I'm very excited about that and should be of interest to this listenership. And I also am working on a second book called Beastly Futures that is specifically thinking about contemporary documentaries around animals and trying to read them symptomatically in order to understand our changing relationship to animals within anthropogenic climate change.
And how can people find out more about your work?
I have a website, Benjamín Schultz-Figueroa.com. You can also find my work on ResearchGate or academia.edu. Don't use them. They're not a great institution, but use ResearchGate. But I do still have it up there too.
Well, thanks so much, Ben, for joining us for this podcast.
Thank you. A pleasure.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. You can follow us on Twitter, or whatever it's called now, at knowing_animals, or you can find us on Facebook at Knowing Animals. You can also follow me on Twitter at Josh L. Milburn, and I'm on Instagram at A Vegan Philosopher. Please do spread the word about Knowing Animals and include it on reading lists if you're teaching this year so students can tune in. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.